First time that I met Mel Gibson, first time that I saw him in person was during the flagellation scene. They were filming in Rome, which is where I was studying theology, and I got to the set. A friend of a friend knew someone working on the movie, and we made our way to the set, and they were filming the flagellation. And Jim was, chained to the stump there, and the soldiers, and whenever they would, do a take, Mel was lying on the ground, out of camera shot, but very close to the action, with a spray gun of red-colored water. And so he would time spraying this, kind of mock blood with the whippings, to add to the realism. And that was my first impression of Mel Gibson in person. A year and a half later, Mel and I were in Los Angeles, and we went to a special screening for an Association of American Protestant Pastors. Leaders of different evangelical groups from around the country came to see the movie as part of the grassroots promotion. And we walked into at the end of the screening, and we met the head of the group, and it was myself and Mel. And the gentleman introduced himself. "I'm so-and-so, nice to have you, thanks for coming, Mel." And then he turned to me, and he was an evangelical Christian. I was dressed like this, and he said, "Mr. Gibson, is this your pastor?" Yeah, and Mel kind of scratched his head, and he looked at me, and, "Well, no, but he'll do in a pinch." He'll do in a pinch. And within that year and a half, from squirting the blood to doing in a pinch, I got to know him pretty well, and I spent a lot of time with him. I won't go into all the details of how I got to know him, but the idea was that I kind of got involved with the film and helping a little bit with the promotion and with strategizing about how to promote the film in the face of so much criticism. I'd like to get right into why we wrote the book. The experience that I had behind the scenes really enriched my experience of the film, because I got to ask Mel why he decided to do things the way he did them. There's so many choices you have to make when you make a film, any work of art. Everything is chosen. And the more I talked to him about it, we would drive from promotion activity to promotion activity in the car, and I'd just talk and ask him questions that no one else had a chance to ask him. The more I said, this is amazing. This is really a deep spiritual insight into a religious subject. It's a great work of art. And so we talked to him about putting together a book. And the book finally came out. It took a long time to get the draft into shape. And I still think, that the more, because it's a great work of art, the more that you understand what went into it, the more you can get out of it. I would like to offer you an invitation before I get into the details of the talk. I think it's worth trying to become an expert in this film. There are few works of religious art in the last 50 years that have been able to touch and move non-religious people. This one has. I'm sure we've all experienced it. This is a religious movie that you were talking about at the water cooler in the office. Very few movies have done that. I hope this is the beginning of a trend, but the fact is it's kind of a unique experience. And if we can all become experts in it, we can take advantage of all those conversations, and it's going to be a perennial thing. The movie's going to come out every year. And we can always, we can even have passion parties and talk about the movie and really use it as an excuse to talk to people and to spread the truth for ourselves and for others. So with that in mind, I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes on 4 different topics related to the film, and then leave about 30 minutes for questions and answers. But with that in mind, that if we can become experts in this great work of art, it's like if you became an expert in the Sistine ceiling, you could give tours to people, and they're all impressed because it's so beautiful. But many of them, it just stays on a level of emotion. It never goes deeper. And I think the movie, if we're experts, we can help people's experience of it go deeper. So the 4 points I'd like to speak about are the origin of the project, why Mel made it, and where it came from. And then a couple of the issues that are always brought up by critics, violence and anti-Semitism. And then finally, a few reflections on the message of the movie and how it impacted the people who worked on it. This movie emerged directly from Mel Gibson's own personal spiritual crisis. About 13 or 14 years ago, he, at the peak of his career, reached a crisis. He had no hope, no meaning. He had everything the world had to offer, but he was miserable and thinking of doing something rash. And it's funny how providence works. But he went home to spend some time with his dad in this state of things. And one morning over breakfast, they were eating their Wheaties, and Mel asked his dad, hadn't told him anything about his crisis. It was a deep crisis. And he asked his dad, he said, "Dad, is there any such thing as a situation without hope?" And his dad, in between bites, without blinking an eye, said, "Nope, no such thing. Because Christ has died and Christ has risen. So there's always hope." And that went to the heart. It really made Mel think. And that was like a little bit of light come into his soul. And he began to read about the passion, Christ's passion, his dying and his resurrection, the Paschal mystery. He started to read, he started to pray about it, he started to meditate on it. And little by little, he began to find hope. And then he began to find faith. He'd grown up Catholic, but as soon as he started his acting career, he kind of left practicing it aside. And he started coming back to it, coming back to the faith, coming back to the Mass. And the more he kind of experienced this, and some things that he read that really moved him at first were St. Bridget's prayers before a crucifix. And then there were a lot of different things that he read. Some older things. There's a Father James Galway, 19th century English priest who was a Jesuit and wrote a 2-volume kind of meditation on the Passion. Mel read that. He couldn't get it. He was just drinking things up and praying and started praying the rosary and the Mass. And he began to experience a real conversion in his own life and to turn his life around. He got to a certain point, he was working on other movies and things. He got to a certain point where he felt that he had to put his experience of the Passion of Christ on film. He had to turn it into a movie. Steve McAvity, one of the producers of the film, tells a story when he was working on What Women Want. A movie very different from the Passion of Christ, I guess. I've never seen it. But he was working on it, and he was in the makeup, and they had to make him look like a woman sometimes. And Steve would say that Mel would call him over. He said, Steve, they're getting his makeup on. He's doing, we got to do the Passion. I want to do the Passion. Find me a screenwriter. It became an obsession. It really became. He felt like he had to communicate to others what he had found himself. That's what artists do, They have to communicate it in the way that they. So he began to work on it, and I think that the fact that it was the fruit of his meditation was reflected in how he actually worked on the film when he was on the set. There are sometimes he makes 3 appearances in the film. Bet you didn't know that. Most people know about one of them, but he's actually appears 3 times. And it shows when he was on the set, he was always involved. He took every role, and he showed the actors what he wanted to do. He played every role when they were working on it to get them right, to help them find the way. Although he left a lot of room for creativity too. It was interesting to see. The most famous, the one that everyone knows about is when they're pounding the nail into Jesus' hand and they're crucifying him. The actor who's doing the soldier wasn't doing it right. They did take after take and it just wasn't right. The angle of the spike wasn't right. And the depth of the indentation, wasn't quite right. And so Mel finally said, he just kind of almost lost patience. He said, let me do it. So they put on the little costume on his wrist, and with his left hand, he took the spike, and there's a close-up of it in the film. You remember that, when the spike begins to penetrate Christ's hand. And after he did that, he reflected on it a little bit. And it was a really moving experience, because he said, I actually did that with my sins. It was my sins that did it. He got a big kick out of the fact that in Italian, the word for left hand is sinistra, sinister. So with my sinister hand, I put the spike into Christ's hand. So he really got into it. It was almost like he was trying to put on film his own meditation. Another time when he was in the scene was in the flashback of Mary Magdalene, where he equates Mary Magdalene with the adulterous woman. And Christ draws a line in the sand, and you see it from the ground level, and the sand and the dirt kind of springs up. And that finger is Mel's. And then when the Pharisees who wanted to stone the woman go away, and Jesus offers his hand to help Mary Magdalene come up, like raising her up to a new start, a fresh start, that was Mel's hand as well. So it was also his feet in the sandals at that point. The reason was because Jim Caviezel they were filming the flagellation at that point, and he had his flagellation makeup on. And it took about 6 hours to get the flagellation makeup on, and so they didn't want to take it off so he could do that scene, and so Mel just kind of stood in. I think there's kind of a providential symbolism there, The same hand that pounded Christ, crucified Christ with his sins, also offered a fresh start to someone else. That's kind of the story of all of our lives. We go from sinners to followers of Christ and to instruments of his mercy. So he really put himself in. And the third cameo that Mel makes is just a vocal cameo, where they tried to get a special effect for the sound of, I don't know if you remember the scene under the bridge, when Jesus falls off the bridge and he sees Judas hiding under the bridge. Jesus is trying to hide, and they have exchange a look, and it's almost as if Jesus is saying, giving him a chance to tell him he's sorry, but Judas doesn't say anything. He can't bring himself to admit that, or to ask for forgiveness, and then they pull Jesus back up. And then there's kind of a strange growling sound, and Judas looks around, and you get this flash of this monster, almost like a demon face, and Judas runs. Well, that sound of the demon was very hard for them to get. They did all kinds of special effects, and they got all the libraries of sound effects, and they mixed them together, and nothing worked. It just wasn't working. So Mel finally said, I'll do it. Give me a microphone. So he went into the sound room. This was in the editing, it was in Los Angeles, and he spent about 20 minutes kind of growling and roaring into the microphone, and he got it right. That was it. So they got it. So that's his voice in there as well. The voice of conscience, it's coming after Judas. So he really put himself into it. And this... So it was much more than just a job or just a work. It was really putting his own meditation onto screen. This also happened, I saw it in a beautiful way, in the post-production process. The controversy was very painful for Mel. Not because he didn't expect it, but because he didn't expect it to be so violent controversy, to be so kind of underhanded. People were stealing copies of the unedited, or the work that they were still editing, and they were seeing it and publishing about it and making accusations about it, and they were making personal attacks against him and his family, and it was painful. You know how he reacted in moments of the deepest crisis? We'd be in the war room there with Steve McAfee figuring out how to respond to all these attacks in the media, and when it would just get too much, Mel would call up Father Bill Fulco, who was the priest who did the translations. And he said, Father Bill, can you come over and can we have Mass? I got to pray for these people. And he would pray for all those people who were going against the movie. That was his response. It was a powerful testimony to me, and also shows what this movie was for him. It came from his heart. It came from his faith. He believed God wanted him to do it. So that's the origin kind of the movie and what it really meant for Mel. I think that helps us appreciate why it was so powerful. Things that come from the heart go to the heart. It's a lesson for us too, in our efforts to spread Christ and spread his kingdom. What we assimilate in prayer and in our own interior spiritual struggles, that's what we're going to be able to communicate. Then the violence. When people say, well, don't you think it was too violent? First, I tried to kind of go back and forth, and finally I just said, it's not too violent. It's obvious that it wasn't too violent. 150 million people saw this movie and loved it and were inspired by it and went and saw it again and then bought the DVD. If it were too violent, they wouldn't have done that. That was my response. I don't think it was too violent. But then thinking about it more, I think it's important to remember why it is so graphic. It's rated R for a reason. And of course, the answer that Mel always gave was he wanted to be as realistic as possible. He wanted to be realistic. He didn't want to sugarcoat it. Because what changed him in his heart was discovering how much Christ suffered to save him. And if you sugarcoat the brutality, you don't get that. You don't get that. And that's what was unsatisfying for him in a lot of other film versions. You don't get the intensity of Christ's love because you don't see the intensity of his suffering. So he wanted to make it as realistic as possible. He says, from all the research that he did, it was actually much more brutal and much more violent. And one of the hardest things for him to do was to find the right balance. Because he wanted to be watchable, but still realistic, still authentic. There was one scene that they cut in the editing during the crowning with thorns. In the screenplay, they were supposed to have a thorn go through Christ's eyelid at that point, just to add, to show that they were really sharp thorns. And they saw it, and it looked very gruesome, and Mel said, yeah, that's just a little too much. We got to pull back. And these kind of decisions, what's too much, how much can we give? It was constant. I think it was successful, but it was constant trying to decide the right balance. Another thing that he did during the flagellation scene, a lot of the critics would say it was too violent. They say, the flagellation is 15 minutes of pure blood, but it's not. If you look at that sequence, you see the flagellation, and then you go and you see Mary. And then you're back to the flagellation, then you see the devil. Then you're back to the flagellation, then there's a flashback. It's constantly going back and forth, so that you actually can see, you get a glimpse of the real intensity of the suffering, but you're able to watch it. You're able to endure it because of the artistry, because of the mix. And some of those flashbacks are beautiful. So it kind of keeps you going. And of course, then Mel says, yeah, but then when you come back, it's even tougher. And he kind of likes that experience of the viewer. So he was always trying to balance it, and I think it really worked. So then I asked myself, well, why do so many people criticize it for being too violent? Because I don't think it was. Some of the criticisms say, well, it was just, it was a ploy to get people to come see the movie, because people love violent movies. So if he makes it really violent, Mel Gibson style, people will come and they'll like that. If that was the ploy, it backfired. Because everyone who I've talked to who hasn't seen the movie has said they didn't go because they were afraid it was going to be too violent. My dad, he still hasn't seen it. So I told him to read my book and then, maybe be motivated to take a look. So I don't think that's a legitimate criticism. What I think really is going on in the critics is, the movie isn't more violent than, Matrix, or only 3 people in this movie die and you only see one of them die. What it is that this movie shows the violence and it also shows the suffering. It's what the other movies don't show. They show the violence and it's kind of glorious, it's like great. And then the good guy fights back and yeah, that's great. But in this movie you see the suffering. And it's the suffering that makes you uncomfortable. Think about it. Is that your experience? It's like, oh, he's such a good man. Even if you don't believe that he's the Son of God, he's such a good man. So obviously he doesn't deserve to suffer so much. And yet he's suffering so much. It's the suffering that makes them uncomfortable. And the critics who panned the movie because of the violence were panning because of the suffering, I think. And that's okay. That's a great point to talk about. People say that. It's great because this religion, Christianity, deals with suffering directly, more so than any other religion, and finds meaning in suffering. I think it's a great springboard for our conversations. And, in Mel's own experience, it was in the midst of his own suffering that he found meaning through the passion, that he found hope in the passion. So the suffering was important. So that as regards the violence. As regards the anti-Semitism, kind of the other big criticism, you have to start with, the gospel is not anti-Semitic. Can't be. Because it's the revelation of God and anti-Semitism is a sin. So it can't be, the gospel can't be anti-Semitic. The Catholic Church teaches that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, condemns it in the Catechism. So if you notice, the people who are afraid that the movie would be anti-Semitic, many of them also think that the gospel itself is anti-Semitic, and that you have to reinterpret and rework the gospel in order to make sure that you don't fall into anti-Semitism. That's a legitimate fear, because the relationship between Jews and Christians through the centuries hasn't always been, roses. There have been Christians who have committed acts of anti-Semitism, and horrible ones. And anti-Semitism is a reality in the history of Western civilization. So I think it's a legitimate fear. For that reason, I'm glad that they brought it up, and the Jewish community brought it up. I think it was an opportunity to talk about it, for Christians and Jews to get to know each other better, and then to see the movie and see that it isn't anti-Semitic. Because the gospel is not anti-Semitic, Mel Gibson wanted to make sure, and he was very careful to make sure to be true to that gospel. And he didn't want to be anti-Semitic. He didn't take any cheap shots at the Jews. The person who looks most Jewish in the movie is Jesus himself. And that was not easy to do. Jim Caviezel does not look Jewish. He's not. He's Swedish or something like that. I can't remember. Swedish, Irish. It took him hours every day, even without the flagellation makeup, to do his face makeup. They gave him a new nose, a whole new... This part of his face was completely reconfigured through the makeup. And they had to shave his head this way, but right here, they shaved from here down, was shaved. Going around the streets of Rome with him was very interesting. People would look at him, he looked kind of barbaric. But they shaved his head and they gave him a whole new head of hair. And he looked, you don't even recognize him in the movie, and you don't even really looks like Jesus. So, and that was a conscious decision. It has to be as Semitic as possible. When they first looked at him and Mel said, yeah, he looks good, we want to get him, but he's got really blue eyes, I can't have, they actually they screened a version to Denzel Washington. You might have heard this story, but they screened it to Denzel and he liked it a lot. He was talking to Mel about it. He said, yeah, it's really good, but this was the non-finished version, and Jim's eyes were still blue, and Denzel said, yeah, it's a good movie, Mel, but it's another blue-eyed Jesus. It's a lot of blue-eyed. And then Mel said, no, we're going to change the color of his eyes. We're going to change his eyes. And they were able to give the brown eyes. But he wanted to be as authentic as possible. And the costumes and the Mary was a Jewish woman who played the role herself. So he was trying to get as authentic as possible. And that included making links between Judaism and Christianity, because Christianity grew out of Judaism, it's the fulfillment. So, and that comes across in a lot of different ways. Some of the other things that show how sensitive Mel was, he had a long, hard kind of decision process dealing with the line in the gospel that says, let his blood be on us and on our children, which is the Jewish leaders ratify the death sentence or the sentence for blasphemy. But that's a formula. The biblical scholars point out that's a formula, a judicial formula for ratification of a sentence. But it doesn't sound like that to us. Right? It sounds like, I'm willing to accept a curse if what I'm doing is wrong. It's a curse. But it's actually just a judicial formula. So you went back and forth and you're saying, well, if I put it in, because it's in the gospel, it's not anti-Semitic. It shows that the trial really happened. It's kind of historical evidence. But if I put it in, people are going to misunderstand it, and then they're going to get distracted. And he went back and forth, and he actually screened both versions. He screened versions with the line in and with the line out in order to get reactions. And he finally decided not to put it in because he thought it would be a distraction. It was a prudential decision, and to show his sensitivity about this. And then there was one of the flashbacks that he added towards the end of actually a month and a half before the film was going to be released. He was still adding flashbacks, things that weren't in the original screenplay. They added the Good Shepherd flashback where Jesus says, he's climbing Calvary, he's got the cross, and Caiaphas and Annas appear to him, and there's kind of a flash of sun, and then he sees Caiaphas and Annas, and there's another flash of sun, and there's a flashback, and you see Jesus' face, and there's a close-up of him preaching the Good Shepherd sermon, I guess you could call it. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. I lay down my life of my own accord. No one takes it from me. I have the power to lay it down and bring it back up again. And then you go back and you see Caiaphas and Annas again. He added that in specifically to emphasize the truth that this was part of God's plan. In the book of Acts, St. Peter and then later St. Paul as well say that the Jewish leaders were ignorant. They didn't know exactly what they were doing. So he wanted to emphasize that this movie is not pointing fingers at anybody except at every sinner. It's just showing what really happened. And that flashback was filmed in a parking lot outside of Panavision in Los Angeles, in the back of a pickup truck. Yes, they had to get him up high enough so they could get the sun in the background, and they did a bunch of... it was funny, the cinematographer for this movie wasn't available to do that flashback, so he had to get the cinematographer who did Braveheart, who won an Academy Award for that cinematography, and he came into just that one scene, in the parking lot, in the back of the pickup truck, just to get it right. Just to show you again, kind of how much detail, how important it was to get every detail correct. I think another good example of the sensitivity that Mel had in this area was the scene, the first time you see Mary, when Jesus has been arrested and they're bringing him in. And then you cut quickly to Mary and she wakes up very quickly. And then she says, her first line is, "Why is this night unlike every other night?" And that's the first line in the ritual of the Passover Seder, the Jewish Passover Seder. That line wasn't in the screenplay. But Maya Morgenstern, who played the role of Mary, when they were filming it, she felt that that line was appropriate. And she's a practicing, believing Jew, so she knew the line. She said, "Mel, can I say this?" And the way he says it is very funny, because she speaks English with an accent. He says, "Can I say this, Mel? Can I say this?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead. Say, what does it mean? Where's it from?" And he went back and forth, and he became very excited about it. So it's perfect, exactly. The beginning of the sacrifice, it's perfect. The lamb, and so it was an addition that he wanted. He said, "Yeah, that's good, because it shows the delicacy of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity." So there's a lot of details that went in like that, and I think he was very sensitive to that. And again, as I said before, I'm glad that the issue came up, because I think there's always a purification of memory that we can be engaged in. My high school drama teacher is Jewish, and when the movie came out, and I told her I was kind of working behind the scenes, and I was spending time with Mel, we talked about it, and she said, "Well, you don't know," she told me, "you don't know what it's like to be called a Christ killer when you're a kid growing up in the city." So she had experienced anti-Semitism. It's a reality. So I'm glad it came up, even though the movie is clearly anti-Semitic. Is not anti-Semitic. It didn't, lead to violent eruptions of hate crimes and anti-Semitic activity or anything like that. So the proof is in the pudding, but it's a good, when people bring it up, it's a great opportunity to talk about all these issues. The last point is the message of the movie. If someone were to ask you, what's the message of the movie? What would you say? Mel always says the movie is about faith, hope, love, and forgiveness. It's a good line. It covers a lot of ground, but it's a good line. It is about that. I think it's important to be able to have an answer to that question as a springboard for discussion, if we're going to be experts in this great work of art. The best answer, in my opinion, is that the movie is about fidelity. First of all, God's fidelity. God is faithful no matter what. No matter what you do, you can't stop God from loving you. Try as hard as you can. Try as hard as the devil tried. All of the devil's attacks were trying to get Jesus to say no. Say, this is too far. Forget it. But Jesus was faithful. He was faithful to his mission. He was faithful to his proclamation of love. God is faithful. But when you see God being faithful in the person of Jesus Christ, as he's depicted in this movie, as he's depicted in the gospel, it says something to you even if you don't believe in the Christian God. Because the nobility of spirit, this man who's able to stay faithful in the face of temptation, in the face of persecution, in the face of violence, over the long haul, brings out the beauty of what it means to be faithful. And if the meaning of human life is to love and to be loved, if that's what we were created for, then the meaning of human life is fidelity. Because love, in time, in history, on this earth, is all about fidelity. Staying faithful through the good times and the bad times. In the dark times and in the joyful times. That's why I think this movie was so powerful for people who don't believe in God. So they saw the example of Jesus, a man who loved to the end. To the end. And that inspires, that moves the human heart, because that's what we're made for. It moved the hearts of the people working on the film as well. The actor who played Judas, Luca, is an Italian guy. As many Italians, grew up in a Catholic family, and as soon as he got out of Catholic school, he stopped, doing anything Catholic and went the other direction. Became an actor. He's a very good actor. It's actually funny, Mel was looking for the actor for Judas, and he chose Luca because the first time he saw him, he said he felt sorry for him. And he wanted Judas to inspire that. He didn't want Judas to be, some kind of ogre, some kind of incarnation of evil. Because Mel said, we're all Judas. So you have to be able to identify with him. So Luca, at the beginning, was very anti-God. On the set of this movie, you couldn't not talk about religion. You just couldn't. We were already talking about religion and spirituality, and people would come, especially when you had your collar on the set, and people would come and they would want to talk, and they would want confession. And so at the beginning, Luca was very anti-God. He was kind of militant atheist. He was the one, no, I don't believe. It doesn't matter. It's just a job. And by the end of the filming, when they were doing the dubbing, actually, I think the big change, it was a long process, but the big change came when he saw the first version of the film. I remember when he came out of the screening that they had for the cast and the crew, and he was deeply, deeply stirred. He was kind of walking around in circles, and everyone else was talking about the movie, and he was over here just walking in circles, he's an intense guy anyway, but he was even more intense. And he asked for confession, and he started getting some instruction. He came over to the seminary. He asked if he could have his children baptized. He asked if he could have his marriage, what do you call that, he wasn't married in the church, so he wanted to bring his marriage. Yeah, he wanted to bring his marriage under God's blessing. Completely changed his life. Completely changed his life. Mel had a production assistant throughout working on the movie, a young lady, very intelligent young lady, speaks many languages. She was great. And she had been alienated from her faith after the death of her teenage brother, who died in a scuba accident. And it was a horrible blow to the family. And she said, if God exists, he wouldn't have let that happen. Suffering, the mystery of suffering. But working on the movie, little by little, it was almost as if, this is something Mel said, and I think he was right, it was almost as if he was putting his meditation on screen, and everyone who was working on the movie was forced to enter into his meditation. They were almost, forced by virtue of working on the film to meditate on Christ. So this production assistant gradually, started wondering, maybe there's more to it. And now she's receiving, she's just finishing up a course in catechesis, kind of one-on-one with a priest I know in Rome, and she'll be receiving confirmation probably very soon. And she's very excited about it. Her life was changed. There's actually a lot of stories like that. I think, though, I'll just mention one more. I think it was the most powerful one. The woman who played Veronica, her name was Sabrina, and she only had that one scene, she was just that one very brief scene. I think they filmed it in 2 days. It was very hard to film that scene. There's kind of the melee of soldiers when Christ falls, and all the soldiers all over the place trying to keep off the crowd, and the crowd's trying to get to Jesus, and then all of a sudden you see Veronica, and she's like an angel. She just comes right to him. Mel said it's as if he was drawing her to him. So she represented all the Christians who believed in him but weren't courageous enough to show their faith that day. But the Holy Spirit drew her as a symbol, a representative. She had to be drawn to him, completely oblivious of all the melee of soldiers and the crowd around her. It was impossible to get it right. Everyone was bumping into her and coming around, and the soldiers hitting her. And so finally he said, it was a tough day on the set that day. And finally he said, he yelled at everyone, "Don't touch her, leave her alone." So then the next time they filmed the take, everyone was just dancing around her, kind of twirling and not touching her, and that didn't work either. It just wasn't quite right. Finally they got it right, And she has this moment, a beautiful moment, kind of strange, and she gets down on her knees and she gives Jesus something, she wipes his face and then she gives him something to drink. And everything stops and the music changes at that time. Everything fades in the background, and it's just those two. seeing each other. And Jim is a very apostolic spirit. He always wanted to talk to people about Christ. He never went in front of the camera without having received Holy Communion. He thought this was a real mission for him. And he had talked to Sabrina a lot before, and they had kind of gotten to know each other. But during that moment, the way Sabrina tells us, she's another one, just like Luca. As soon as she stopped going to school, she stopped believing. She had Catholic background, she stopped believing. She just, no more God, no more religion, it's all hypocrisy. And then she stopped believing. At that moment, the way she describes it, when she was doing the scene and looking into Christ's eyes, she says, "Ho creduto." I believed. For a moment, I believed. And she's still struggling, she's still working through things, but it was a reference point. It was like the parting of the waters of her life and her journey. Ho creduto. I believed. That's what was going on. The fidelity of Christ has the power to change hearts. So I'd like to, before I take questions, just reiterate the invitation. I think it's worth trying to become an expert in this movie. The book can help, but so can your own reflections and your own prayer. I mentioned that Jim received Holy Communion before every time he went on the screen. Even in the pickup truck flashback, he called in Father Bill, brought in the Lord. I think there's a lesson in that for us. Jim was able to image Christ. You don't even realize it's an actor. He really, really looks like Christ. He acts like Christ. The Eucharist is the secret to that for all of us. He gives us his own body and blood so that we can be other Christs. We can image Christ in this world, in his fidelity of love. So as we strive to become experts in the film, experts in the passion of Christ, I think the secret to the success of that endeavor would be a deep intimacy with Christ in the Eucharist. So thank you very much. And I guess we can take questions and answers. I don't know, whatever they may be about anything. Yes, please.
You've said several times that he looked like Christ. Is that some universal concept that we all have? How do you define that?
When I say the phrase he looked like Christ, what I mean is not so much his physical appearance, because we don't really know. Although it's interesting to know what went into their decisions, the Mel decision about how to depict Christ. He studied the Shroud of Turin a lot, and he also studied the whole history of iconography. And he found certain characteristics in the most authentic representations, but even some of the later, Renaissance representations, there are certain characteristics that were consistent. The shape of the nose, the shape of this face of this part of the face, and also the forehead, kind of a triangle. When you furrow your brow, in all these images of Christ, there's a triangular arrangement of the wrinkles. And Jim had that. Jim had that in a way, that everyone has it. Mel was very excited about that when Jim had that. And I said, "Oh, that's great. That's exactly what it is." And so physically, they tried to make it authentic. At least an image that didn't clash with what we have in our minds, an image that could very well be what Jesus looked like. But when I say he looked like Christ, I really think that he acted like Christ. He was virile and strong and masculine. I think Christ must have been that because he was a man. But at the same time, he was extremely spiritual. It's very hard to depict that on film. Most of the time, if you depict a man who's spiritual on film, he's not real masculine. Yeah, a wuss, very well put. So, yeah. But this one wasn't. He's athletic. He's tough. The guards in the garden, are at first they don't want to, I don't want to. He could beat me up, And I think that, so when I say he looked like Christ, I think he gives the impression of what Christ must have been, the presence, the way that everyone he encounters is affected by him. Even though he's in a position of weakness, he actually affects everyone from a position of strength. Pilate, the guards, even Annas and Caiaphas. So I think that's what I mean more than anything. But at different levels, it could work. Other questions? Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I have a few friends who are Catholics, but not very practicing, sort of similar situation, and who did see the film and still say they think it's too violent. But it's interesting, they didn't experience, I experienced tremendous emotion, spiritual, connection.
Yeah.
They said they have any of that, I'm just wondering if it's like, the old Macbeth said, you protest too much or whatever, that they just didn't let themselves go there, or a very interesting reaction, because every time I talk to them, they won't tell me that. It's just too many times.
Yeah, right.
Too violent, like you say, too violent, didn't interest them. Why would they bring it up again?
Yeah, I'm sure we've all met people who had a similar experience, a similar reaction to that. I really think, and it's just my personal opinion though, that the key to that is the distinction between violence and suffering. What makes them uncomfortable is the suffering. Invite them to see the recut. They're going to release a recut, the Passion recut. He's cutting out 6 minutes of some of the graphic brutality, which I think is I'm very glad he's doing it, because it gives us an opportunity for people like this, to come back and say, well, see it again, and then we'll talk about it, and see it and talk about it, and maybe we can figure out why I reacted so differently than you. Let's talk about it. It's great. I don't think it was too violent. Let's see it again. I think it's a springboard for discussion.
If I'm correct, that whole scene with flagellation is what is very exact about it. The guy counts to 25 twice, and this was no longer shorter than it actually happened.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. Although some scholars say that there would be, if they number the amount of wounds on the Shroud of Turin, if you give some validity to that relic, there's actually many more stripes, like they went beyond the limit. But you're right, he chose to make, the choices that he made were based on research and based on as authentic as possible.
I think that's, for me, it took away from the horror of the scene, was listening
to the right, yeah.
Guys counting the thing, and it was like, well,
that's what it
reality,
is.
That's what they did, so they stood there and counted the
Yeah, it's definitely not gratuitous. It's not gratuitous. It has meaning. There's a lot of other levels of the violence too. The blood of Christ being spilled for our sins. The evil of sin. The violence, the graphic violence, is an image of the evil of sin. When we sin, we're doing that. We're doing that to other people, to their souls. We're doing it to our own soul, and we're doing it to Christ Himself, to God. That's what sin is. Sin is a denial of the existence of the other. I'm more important. What I want matters. So, yes?
Would you care to comment on the significance of the crow as a crucifixion? I understand that there was some influence of Flannery O'Connor over Mel Gibson, her writings, which were graphic, that he introduced that, and why he did.
The crow. Just a quick survey before I answer. How many of you thought the crow was going a little too far? Raise your hand if you thought. Some of you did. Most of you. I asked him about that, because it constantly came up. It's like, it's a little too Hollywood. It's like, and he said what he wanted to do. He didn't mention Flannery O'Connor at all. I don't even know if he's read her works. I would guess that he hasn't, to be honest. But he might have. But he didn't mention it when we talked about it. And he said, well, what I wanted to depict was the horror of crucifixion. And the fact of the matter is, even though Christ was only up for 3 hours or so, crucifixion itself often took, if someone was crucified, it would take them days sometimes to die. And it was a very slow death. And the birds of carrion would come for fresh meat before the victim was dead. It was common practice in descriptions of crucifixions in historical literature and primary sources. They discuss that. The insects would lay their eggs and incubate in the living flesh of the victim, and the birds would come as well. And so Mel wanted to depict the horror of the crucifixion. But there's another level to it. That thief, the one who rejects Christ, and yells at Christ and doesn't believe in Christ and laughs and mocks at Him, that's the one that the crow comes to. And I said, so Mel, is it like a punishment? The crow pecks out his eye because he doesn't see who Christ is. And the punishment for sin is always in proportion with the nature of the sin, right? And he said, that's a great idea, but no, it's a great idea. He said, no, but then he said something very interesting. I think something theologically much deeper. He said, that guy, from the beginning, it was like the devil was inside of him. It's like the devil had taken possession of him. And the devil, when he does that, when he gets inside of us, he draws horrible things to us. He draws horrible things into our lives. And it's just like, the devil said, well, let's draw a crow here, and, something horrible to this guy. And so it was a concept of evil as experienced by that sinner. And very, very, theologically, it's very accurate and a great insight. Of course, I will admit, that he said, you're talking about it, he said, yeah, but when you see that on film, it's just, you can't look away. It really grabs you. There's the bird, and then you say, the bird, what's the bird doing there? Then you see the eyeball, and you say, oh, no, and then you see it, you can't look away. It's so kind of gripping. Yes?
How is Mel handling all the rejection by the industry? Academy Awards and things like that.
I think he's handling it gracefully. On the outside. On the inside, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard for me to describe how much I respect him and his courage that he's shown in this whole project and throughout the project. Before, he didn't know it was going to be a huge success, first of all. He couldn't get investors. He had to risk his own money. And before it started, in the early days, he identified it, and his producer did too, excuse me, as a career-killing project. I know people are going to blackball me for this, but I have to do it. I want to do it. But he hasn't responded to, it wasn't very popular among, the peer group there in Hollywood, the movie at all. But he hasn't responded by kind of entering into a fight about it. And he says, I did it, it's out there, and I'm going to keep making movies, and, and he hasn't kind of lowered himself to enter into the fray. But I can't say that it hasn't been hard and difficult at times. It's to be persecuted for your faith in whatever way, directly or indirectly, is always difficult, and he's experienced that. He's experienced that. Yes?
I think that on that point, they could be making 100,000 films or 200,000 films, but this film will be probably the most remembered film in the centuries to come.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Just a living piece of work.
Yeah.
I know, just another point, is if anybody has trouble saying the rosary, you now have kind of living pictures that you can rely upon when you go from the different, through the different parts of the rosary.
Yeah. It's true. I consider it, I talk about it as a work of art. A great work of art that's inexhaustible in its richness. It's gonna last. As long as people are watching movies, they're gonna be watching this movie. There's some hands over here, I think. Yes?
Yes, I had a question, getting back to the film itself, different scenes. And the one scene, there were certain scenes that people were talking about and they didn't know what to make of it. And the one in particular that comes to my mind was during the flagellation scene. They showed the Blessed Mother walking and then the devil walking and holding a child. And some people guessed that child was the newborn Judas into hell after suicide. And other people were saying, no, that's just, evil living on. Do you have any, it's kind of going back and forth. Who is that supposed to be?
There's two levels of conscious intent. I'm putting that in there. One was artistic and one was theological. But I'm going to preface saying what they were by another comment, a general comment. I asked Mel at the beginning of the process when we decided to do a book, and he said, yeah, let's do it, let's talk about it. And so I asked him, one of the questions I asked him in our conversations was, You know, Mel, when people give interpretations to scenes that you didn't think of, is that okay? And he said, again, I really think he's a great artist. He really is a great artist. He had a great answer to that question. He said, yeah, it's okay, it's okay. And then he thought for a minute, he said, as long as they're sincere. In other words, as long as the interpretation came out of the film, as opposed to those who made up their minds what the film was about and what it was going to mean, and they came in with their preconceived, parameters, and they pasted those onto the movie. That's not being sincere. And he said, those aren't good interpretations. But if it comes out of the film, that's fine, that's good. We talked about it some more, and I think it's a general experience of artists that a lot of times they get a flash of insight. And there's a lot more levels to it than even they're aware of. And something actually that Sigmund Freud wrote about that. The intentionality in the artist. But I think in his case, he would say, yeah, sometimes I just know it's right. And it just has to be like that. But I'm not exactly sure why. And then other people, when they see it, they get a lot out of it. I think that's a sign of a great artist. It shows, it proves inspiration. He was inspired to put something up there that people can find meaning in. That it's inexhaustible. You can find more and more. Okay, so that's the general kind of qualification. The 2 levels of intent on the hairy baby, that they have there. Artistically, that happens at the point when they turn Jesus over and begin to whip him on his chest. An intensification, it's really hard to keep watching at that point. So he needed artistically to balance. Again, we went back to, he wanted to be able to show that, to show the intensity of the pain, but he had to balance it visually with another image so that it wasn't an overdose of the blood and the gore. And so he had an idea. He said, well, to give the devil in a different posture, to give the imagination somewhere else to go, so that I can come back then and I can still endure the pain of the... so that was kind of an artistic level. Why that image, though? Why, it goes back to the whole concept that Mel has of evil in the film. Evil as the distortion of something good. Which is perfect, theologically, philosophically, it's a great definition. The actor who played the devil was a woman, a very beautiful woman. They shaved her eyebrows. When she spoke, they dubbed in a man's voice. Something beautiful, something good, distorted. Just not quite right. Not quite right. And then, of course, when the maggot crawls out of her nose, it's very not right. Mel calls that the devil's calling card. So you know who that is. So it's a distortion of something good. Now, at the time when they turn Jesus over and they're flagellating him on his chest, it's an intensification of the injustice, the evil that is being manifested in Christ's suffering, right? So when you see the devil at that point, you have to see an intensification of the distortion of something that's good. So it's no longer merely a beautiful woman who's distorted into being the devil, but it's something that's even better. It's a mother and her child, the perfect icon of goodness and beauty. You can't get anything more beautiful. It's a perfect icon of goodness and beauty. If he distorts that, it shows an intensification of the presence of evil. You follow? So that's the theological level of intent. But it doesn't go to say that these other interpretations are invalid or wrong, for the reason that I mentioned at the beginning. Yes?
One of the difficulties of Mel Gibson not asking us permission for a movie is that a lot of us weren't ready for it. It's like, we've gone through life, we haven't had the time, and all of a sudden we're faced with having to explain the core of our belief to absolute strangers. They say, oh, you're a Christian, what's that mean? And I think that was really interesting how many everyday Christians that had an automatic son explain their belief.
Oh, yeah.
And something I keep on hearing you say is we have to become experts in this film. I mean, it's not like it's an option because people are going to ask us. what answer we're going to get.
Yeah, and it's a great opportunity.
It's just interesting, the training that regular lay people have to actually express, the meaning of what they believe. It's, sometimes the parishes do it really well, sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Get copies of the book in all the parishes, and we'll do courses. Yes?
I don't think you could just see this movie once. I think you have, I saw it 3 times, and each time I got a different message from it. It was just so profound. After the first time I had not to work, and people said to me, well, I heard the soundtrack, it's great. I said, I never even heard the music. I was concentrating so much on the message in the film. But I saw it 3 times, and like I said, I just loved it.
Yeah.
Very profound.
I make a recommendation to everyone to see it every Friday during Lent. It's like Stations of the Cross, every Friday, and invite people over, to see it with them.
Friday party.
There you go. That's right. Perfect. Yeah. Right. Right. You're gathering. Yes.
To follow both of those points, you talk about becoming an expert in the movie, and I felt this was a very intense religious experience for me. I went through communion and confirmation, but this was more of an experience for me. Could you ever envision this being incorporated into, and I didn't attend Catholic school, I did CCD, so could you ever envision this being incorporated into children's, receiving the sacraments? Is it too intense? I mean, I would have appreciated having education because there were little points where I was questioning
Yeah.
what was happening.
Right. Well, I know priests and lay people who have already, begun incorporating it